Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Caderna podcast. I'm Brian Caderna. This is an episode I truly believe everyone needs to listen to, as it's a global matter that affects all of us and is unfolding right before our eyes. This episode is being aired on November 3rd, 2023, roughly 1 month since the Palestinian Islamist militant group Hamas conducted their surprise attack on Israel on October 7th. Currently, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel as they continue their ground assault on Hamas and have surrounded Gaza City. Later this month, President Joe Biden is set to meet with President Xi Jinping in China to discuss the issue. So obviously, this comes at a great time that I get to sit down and interview Elaine Dezenski. Elaine is the Senior Director and Head of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or FDD. If you're not familiar with the FDD, they're a Washington-based research institute that was founded shortly after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Their focus is foreign policy and national security. Their experts, which come from the top ranks of government, intelligence, military, and the private sector, have guided the Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. Elaine brings over 2 decades of leadership in public, private, and international organizations, and is a globally recognized expert and thought leader on geopolitical risk, supply chain security, anti-corruption, and national security. She previously served as Senior Director at the World Economic Forum from 2010 to 2015, after which she launched her company LumiRisk LCC, a risk advisory practice. In 2017, she served as Senior Fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University and was a lecturer of business ethics. From 2020 to 2021, she served on the newly formed Chairman's Council on China Competition at the Export-Import Bank of the United States. She has held both political and career positions with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and senior roles at INTERPOL, Crossmatch Technologies, and Siemens Corporation. I'll put a link in the show note to Elaine's bio and some of her latest research if you'd like to learn more. So in today's episode, Elaine and I will be discussing those U.S.-China relations and their Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. And then we'll move on to talk about Israel-Hamas and what's unfolding there. And we dive into terrorist financing. How exactly do these organizations get their money and their resources, often in some of the poorest spots of the world? So we just scratched the surface on some of these very complex geopolitical issues. But over the next hour, we'll bring everyone up to speed on what's unfolding and how to contextualize it all. So without further ado, here is Elaine Dezenski.
Is going to require work and time and sweat and toil.
If money wasn't an issue, what would I be doing?
Don't worry about it. You'll figure it out.
Change is the only constant.
The Caderna Podcast.
Elaine, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be here. Appreciate the invite.
Yeah, and I don't think this could be any more timely with what's going on in the world. It just seems like we're always dealing with a bit of chaos at any given point in time. I mean, if we could just get kind of that 10,000 foot view, as this is airing here, end of October, early November 2023, so much going on over in the Middle East. It seems like Ukraine and Russia has almost been put on a back burner of sorts. I think people, the public, are almost getting punch drunk at this point with just so many current events grabbing headlines. In your profession, does it feel like it's always kind of like this? There's always something bubbling, or are we in a bit of a crazy time here?
Well, yeah, it's a great question and a great place to start the conversation. I do think there is more of a sense right now of the world being on fire. And as I was reflecting over the weekend, thinking about where we might take this conversation, it occurred to me that, we're still in this post-COVID space, which I think is contributing to a great extent to this sense of uncertainty, despite, for example, in the U.S., despite the fact that, the economic indicators are not that bad. There's still that underlying sense of fear and concern about where things are going. And of course, what we see more broadly in terms of the geopolitical space is in some ways a confirmation of that. So whether it's the heightened issues and tensions with China, the very serious issues in the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, it is happening on multiple fronts, and this does feel different in terms of the impact, right? And how to make sense of all of this. And maybe that's something we should spend a little time thinking about today, or talking about. How do we make sense of all of these risks that are not only playing out independently but are connected to each other, right? It's this interdependence of global challenges right now that is difficult to navigate, I think, in a kind of unique way. And part of that, again, is going back to being in this post-COVID environment, and being in a somewhat in a state of recovery globally, right?
Mm-hmm.
With huge impact on the global South, and this kind of questioning more broadly around U.S. leadership globally, and whether that's coming from the economic side or the political side, some real tests of that in new and different ways, and perhaps kind of resurfacing some of the challenges that maybe we thought we had dealt with 20 years ago, particularly around terrorism and terrorist financing, that are coming back in a big way. So.
Yeah, and I definitely want to dive deeper into that as well.
Yeah.
So you mentioned COVID, which in some ways it seems like yesterday, in other ways it feels like it was a lifetime ago, like it's in the rearview mirror. Obviously, it changed the world, no question about it. But did it change any of the global dynamics as far as international relations? I mean, did we have new allies, new adversaries? Did the stage change at all, or are the actors the same, the roles the same, and it just kind of brought new things to light?
I think it's both. So one thing that completely changed as a result of COVID, at least from my vantage point, is how we think about our supply chain dependencies. I think it was really a shock when the U.S. determined that it was going to be difficult to get protective gear out of China, for example, that we weren't going to be able to rely on certain kinds of imports coming from the Chinese government. That was, I think, a serious wake-up call in terms of understanding what that relationship really held for us, and this deeper conversation around dependencies on China, whether we're talking about medical equipment and supplies or critical minerals, right? It kind of runs the gamut across many different areas that we might consider to be strategic, and that really forced a rethinking of this question around dependencies. So what's happening now is, in essence, again, from my perspective, a bit of a global rewiring around these relationships and how we think about trade, how we think about the flow of capital coming out of the U.S. and more broadly Western allies, where that capital is going, what it's supporting, and what the risk profile looks like now for operating abroad, particularly in China. So this is causing a huge kind of rethinking. And when I talk to U.S. manufacturers, for example, who have a big footprint in China, a lot of them have already moved to what they call the China Plus One strategy. So they have a supply chain linked into China, but they're looking at that alternative, so that if we're faced with another global shock, or it just becomes too difficult to operate, and in some cases it already has become very difficult to operate, that there are viable alternatives. We've also seen a huge decrease in the amount of foreign investment going into China. It's down massively over the last year or so. So this is an interesting question about how the markets are responding, and the fact that sometimes the markets respond whether the government does anything or not, or just a signal, a minor signal even from the government that there's a problem may effectuate a huge shift. And so this is the rewiring that that I'm talking about. It's happening because markets respond to risk.
And so I like that you mentioned, a lot of major manufacturers are adopting this kind of China Plus One policy. Who is that plus one? Are you seeing some commonality there of where people are turning, where business is going?
That's a great question. I mean, it really depends on the sector. So I think for certain kinds of electronics, there are probably pivot strategies in Asia, looking to Vietnam, looking to India, maybe to South Korea, other potential locations where the supply chain maybe doesn't need to go too far. In other cases, we might be looking at emerging supply chains and technologies that may ultimately get rooted elsewhere, whether that's looking at EV components maybe coming out of Mexico or South America, the potential to move some supply chains home where that's possible. It's not always possible, not always ideal to do that. So I think there are potential beneficiaries both in Southeast Asia and even in our own hemisphere. But it will be really dependent upon the particular kind of business. I think one question is becoming very clear, which is how to protect advanced technologies and the intellectual property associated with that. I mean, to the extent that we allowed U.S. technology and IP to kind of filter into the Chinese ecosystem, sometimes with rights and sometimes without, right? Sometimes it was just taken. I think that is going to be a real point of contention going forward because the stakes are getting much, much higher.
Okay. And maybe we could use that as a launch pad today. I know everything going on in Israel is kind of front and center, but maybe we can start with China. I mean, frankly, the elephant in the room, and then we'll come full circle here. So I know earlier this year, you wrote an article that was titled, "How Xi Jinping's Policies Could Lead China to Economic Implosion." You talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road 2.0, and just what they're trying to do to really broaden their reach around the globe. And one of the things that I had read about and I've researched as well before is you say that China lent out over $1 trillion of loans, and they did so at commercial rates, where we do a lot of the same thing, but we would use it as aid or subsidized loans. Was that a smart move on their part? Because it just seems like, from the layman's perspective, they make these loans to sometimes these third world, countries that don't have a lot of structure, and they've got to go in there knowing like this is most likely going to default. And is that by design, where they say, okay, now you owe us via your commodities or other strategies? What's that look like? Is that working or is that not working?
Yeah. So let's unpack this a bit. This is
Sure.
the kind of key strategic question around the Belt and Road Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Did Beijing design this program to be one of debt dependency and debt trap? Was that part of the strategy versus this idea that they wanted to go in with quote unquote no strings attached? So we're going to lend you money. We're going to make it available quickly. We're not going to ask you to do environmental planning. We're not going to, ensure that there's local value. We'll bring in Chinese manufacturers, Chinese labor, which is what happened for a lot of these projects, and hoping that would be a way to extend their footprint. And so in that latter case, it's more or less worked. I think what they didn't anticipate was the massive economic slowdown as a result of COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another China challenge that has made it impossible for a lot of these countries to service that debt. And because the Chinese loans, not all of them, but a good chunk of them, are at market rates or at different rates, or they look different than the World Bank loans and other multilateral development loans. They're also coming up as the first creditors to get paid back. So if they're agreeing to renegotiate these loans, and in some cases that China has agreed to renegotiate, they're often doing it at market rates that are still above what would be coming from other development type sources. So I don't think that the BRI was specifically set up as a debt trap. I just think it was bad planning on the part of Beijing. I mean, the BRI, in essence, I mean, people talk about it as a kind of this massive $1 trillion initiative. And, even I've talked about it that way in some of my pieces. But if you look kind of under the tent, what you see is 1,000 different projects with many different players, and in some ways a lack of centralized coordination. So it was almost like a lot of these Chinese entities were deputized to go out and do these deals. But at the end of the day, there wasn't a lot of coordination. And so that's part of the problem. Like, it's hard to define what this is or what the impact was intended to be. Now, what Beijing has said they wanted to do with this was create this global infrastructure investment strategy that would bring development to other parts of the world, kind of based on this Chinese model. But if you look at, whether it's achieved that broader goal of being clean and green and transparent, which is all how they, all words that they've used to describe it, it really hasn't met that bar. There are some projects that have been successful, but a lot that really haven't. So
do they,
at the end,
if I could jump in, I mean, do you think that they really meant that? Because I feel like when everybody hears China, the last thing they're going to think is clean and green. They think they might be productive. They're a powerhouse of exports, et cetera. But I don't think anyone said, oh, they play by all the same rules that we do. I didn't even realize that was in their language, that they were even trying to kind of market that. I assume that's just lip service. I mean, are they trying to do anything to kind of get on board with the green movement?
I think it's been a useful narrative. They've made some more recent commitments to funding green projects. They've made very recent commitments. They just had a summit in October, actually, where they talked about putting in some mechanisms for project integrity, project compliance. But these are coming late. I mean, they're 10 years into it, and so no, I don't think it's been more than lip service. But it's been a convenient rhetoric, right, to be able to kind of create this narrative that there's that there's sort of this broader benefit to society. There's a broader strategic objective that is in alignment with transparent, fully functioning infrastructure. But the reality is something that looks very, very different.
Okay. Yeah. And what you mentioned, like that it sounds like they kind of just throw it all at the wall and see what sticks approach that's been happening without a lot of centralization going on. What are maybe some of the biggest areas that they are investing in, regions or countries where most of that money has flowed?
Yeah. So there's certainly a lot of it in Southeast Asia and into Pakistan, for example. They've identified certain strategic corridors that have been of particular interest. And they tend to coincide with where China is looking for access to maritime routes or looking for overland accessibility to more trade, for example. So routes into Europe. There are some corridors and projects in Africa that are strategic in terms of mining, extraction of critical minerals or infrastructure to support new rail lines and the like. So there's definitely a more strategic play around some of it. But then when you look at the corridors and how the projects are structured and moving along, I'm not sure that they're kind of delivering the full strategic value. We have a lot of projects, for example, in Africa. There's the Kenya Nairobi rail line, freight rail line that is hardly used. It really isn't delivering. So some of these grand projects that were part of the initial pitch have kind of made way now to smaller projects that may be in the same corridors but aren't as as encompassing or as large. So I do think we're going to see a movement towards smaller projects and probably more strategic, maybe focus more on digital infrastructure. So that's a big thing. So expansion of 5G networks, surveillance equipment, communications. So helping governments kind of improve that IT connectivity will probably be front and center. And then, yeah.
And so some of those areas that you mentioned that China's making a push for development, and those governments or whoever's in power there, are they negotiating with China? Are they entertaining other offers? Is Germany, is America, is Britain coming in saying, hey, we'll develop the rail line or we'll build some infrastructure? Or is China the only one kind of going into some of these maybe niche areas? And do they have so much power where those governments are saying, okay, China wants to work with us, whatever you guys want, you got it. How much kind of back and forth is there? And are we, the Western world, are we involved?
Yeah, great question. So I would say for the first 7 or 8 years of the BRI, it was pretty much a China-only game. It's only in the last few years that the dynamics have started to shift, with the U.S. taking this issue a bit more seriously in terms of providing a credible alternative. I mean, I should say that the U.S. is still investing more and providing more development aid and engagement than any other country in the world. But it's not necessarily focused on the kinds of projects, the infrastructure projects that China has zeroed in on as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But more recently, the U.S. has taken a turn in terms of its approach. It started under the Trump administration and it's continued under the Biden administration. One major change was the setup of the new U.S. Development Finance Corporation, which is an interesting agency. They actually have equity capacity. So not only can they provide financing, but they can actually invest in projects, make equity investments in infrastructure projects throughout the world. So this is a huge shift. It doesn't compare to what China is investing, but it's a starting point, and it's meant to serve as leverage to bring more Western capital, more U.S. capital into private, that is, into infrastructure projects throughout the world. So that was a huge shift that came into effect around 2019 or so. And then we've been doing a lot more with Exim Bank to try to push certain kinds of U.S. manufacturing and supply chains that have impact internationally and can support broader engagement around advanced technologies and the like. But I would say, we're just getting started on this. Biden recently announced the Global Partnership for Infrastructure Investment. That is meant to be a multilateral engagement strategy with Europe and other allies to put more funds into strategic corridors, one of which is in the Middle East. Although I think that, may be a challenge in the near term. So we're starting to do that. I think a lot of countries would say, sure, if there was a credible alternative to Chinese funds, we would consider it. It's always better to have more options. But I think the ground game for the U.S. In this space, it has been pretty weak.
Okay. Now it's good to know. And in the same article I had mentioned a moment ago, I just want to steal a quote from you real quick. You said that Russia, which every day inches closer to becoming a failed state, is currently China's largest ally. And certainly Iran, Syria, Venezuela, North Korea, and Cuba would love to continue to align with China. But all of those countries combined have a GDP less than that of the Netherlands. So it seems like China's got these grandiose initiatives. They're the other superpower opposite the U.S. But do they have? It seems like they don't really have the connections with allies that America has, and then most of the business done, for China is with us, with the U.S.
Right.
So I don't think that they're going to ever be able to kind of like decouple and say, hey, we built our own thing over here. We're now independent of the U.S. in any way. Is that a problem for China? Would you say, like, if we had to just compare the two countries, is that where we maybe have a leg up on them? Is more developed allies, or what's maybe your take on that?
Yeah. So I'm really glad you asked that question, because I do think it's worth it to take a step back to look at this question of alliances and exactly what we're facing right now. No doubt the U.S. has strong alliance and connectivity to Europe, certainly within North America, and with strategic partners in Asia as well, Southeast Asia in particular, where they're quite concerned about the growing influence and potential threat of China.
Yeah.
So China's alliances look a bit different. For sure, we can count Russia in that category, although, as I've written, if we look at what's happening in Russia, the trajectory is not good. Certainly not over the long term, but even in the midterm. So where does that leave China? I mean, India is not a strong ally of China. And what China has built through the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is mostly engagement with the global South. So that's really where they've put a lot of their focus. And that's why you see them heavily engaging through BRICS, the BRICS alliance. It's why they had a big summit in Beijing last month celebrating 10 years of the BRI, because it brought more than 110 countries to Beijing. So they're really focusing on that space and trying to develop it. And there are a lot of strategic reasons why they want to do that. They were also hoping that they were going to peel Europe away from the U.S. Right, and I would say pre-COVID they were probably making a lot more progress than we would have liked. I think that dynamic has generally shifted in Europe. They're seeing the threat with China in a slightly different way. So, and of course, NATO's response to Russia was another kind of pushback against China, saying, well, if we can split the U.S. and Europe, that's very strategic for our expansion. So I think China is facing some headwinds in terms of its ability to win friends and influence people, if I may say, because there is, I think, growing concern about how they're operating and where they're operating.
Okay.
But yeah.
Yep. And so maybe just to kind of pivot a little bit, still in the same area, talking about China, just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure you probably saw on 60 Minutes, they had the Five Eyes, which were the intelligence directors from the U.S. and our English-speaking allies. And so the FBI director, Chris Wray, said, and I'm quoting here, "The People's Republic of China represents the defining threat of this generation." And then he went on to mention that there's roughly 2,000 active investigations relating to Chinese spying and theft of information here in America. So, I mean, is that something, would all kind of countries say, we're all doing the same thing? And are we doing the same thing China's doing to us? Are we doing it to them and we don't hear about it? Like, is it a level playing field, or is this something that's like a grave concern that we're losing?
Yeah, another great question. I think there's a tremendous amount of Chinese influence in this country that we're just starting to understand. And certainly Chris Wray was somebody who would have a deep and profound view on that and the implications of it. But, whether we're talking about the influence through academic institutions, where we have a lot of Chinese engagement and have for years, right, at the research level, but also students who've been coming for a long time, and some of the loopholes that have been made clear, and the fact that we've got a real challenge there with these academic relationships, that's soft power, if you will, that has been a funnel, right, to move a lot of innovation and ideas back to the Chinese mainland. I'm not sure we have the equivalent situation in China, where because the U.S. footprint there looks a lot different, right?
How so?
I think, so we don't have the number of students going over to China. We're not as interested in their technology base. I mean, with some exceptions, maybe in the AI space, we continue to lead on most technology and research. That may change over time, but we still have a lot that is of interest to the Chinese establishment and to their economic growth and trajectory. So that playing field does not look kind of equivalent. if we're talking about, more around the national intelligence space and our ability to, to have effective means of gaining intelligence in China versus their ability to gain it here, I don't feel like I'm the best judge of that. I think, there's a big game there, which involves, everybody. And we're pretty good on surveillance, and so are they. But that's not unlike what we faced, throughout the Cold War. With Soviet
I know.
Union. So,
I think it just kind of raised everybody's eyes, no pun intended, when we had a gigantic balloon literally go all the way across the country.
Yeah.
And I was like, I think a lot of people were like, why is this so okay? That we literally let it go from one side to the other without really being worried. And then said, okay, now we'll take it down.
Yeah.
But,
that was not okay.
And I think that's what most people would conclude, which is strange to me. But nevertheless, kind of from like an economic standpoint, I know that's a little more in your wheelhouse. So my understanding, after President Mao Zedong passed away in 1976, they started their open door policy, and Chinese growth just exploded and did so for decades. And now they have what a lot of people call this state-run capitalism, where in some respects they're kind of like us, having some capitalist elements, but they have so much control, as a communist party does. Do you think that gives them an advantage of sort? Because I know lots of times people will say about America, we're the land of the free, the capitalists, we're just this super machine that can't be stopped. However, we're constantly looking like at 4-year intervals of there's another election coming, and then there's another election right around the corner. And we have these little snippets that we keep pursuing where a Putin or a Xi Jinping can say, I'll look at the next 30 years because I'm going to call the shots. Yeah. You would just think that gives them so much more of an advantage from a planning perspective than kind of like our up and down bit of a roller coaster of Republican Democrat. And I know this is another huge question, but from just like a system standpoint, do they have an advantage there, or is that just kind of a failed thought?
Yeah. So I think the short answer is it depends. The existence of this sort of centralized planning mechanism and the ability to take the long view, right? Because there's less turmoil and churn within their political system, and a lot more top-down engagement and infiltration, right, of the Chinese Communist Party into state-owned enterprises, which by design are an extension of the government, but also into their quote-unquote private sector, which really doesn't look a whole lot like, or looks less and less like our private sector because of the engagement of the state. Yes, all of this allows them to turn the machine in ways that are more coordinated and can help them situate, I think, in some ways more effectively over the long term. But there's also a limit on that, and in some ways, I think we're seeing that limitation. It's a question about when that centralized system and that top-down approach simply becomes too heavy and starts to send the wrong messages or makes it too difficult to operate. That's what we're seeing, I think, in the early stages right now with U.S. businesses operating in China and other, let's say, Western interests that are finding it more and more difficult to operate because they can't conduct due diligence anymore, or not without the potential to be pulled in, right, or pushed out of the country. The anti-espionage laws and the national intelligence laws, this framework of legality essentially deputizes every Chinese individual and company operating outside of China to be a gatherer of intelligence and information that if it has national security implications, needs to be shared with the Chinese government. So there's a lot going on with the kind of legal and regulatory space that's making it much more difficult for businesses to operate. So it's part of this kind of top-down approach, but it's having a massive impact in terms of capital, right? And whether it's worth the risk to push new capital into a place like China. So even with the best laid plans, if the market is responding in a way that is counterintuitive to what China seeks to build, right, which is to drive this export market as long as they can and make the shift to a consumption orientation, build up the services sector, build up higher value in manufacturing, none of that is going to happen as quickly if the base, right, of the economy shrinks.
Yeah.
So, so I think you can argue that right now, I know we're talking about this at a, not at a highly detailed level, but if they're killing off the golden goose as a result of this kind of top-down pressure on the system, and making it difficult for the market to manage those risks, then they're undermining their own objective. So
it's interesting.
So I do think there's some limitation around this idea that you can have the best laid plans and they're all going to come to fruition. No, because you can't control the market dynamics. I mean, that's because markets act as markets do. Now, on the other hand, you have the U.S. where we go through this churn, and every 4 years we have the potential for a big shift in our policies and whatnot. That is also becoming increasingly hard for us to manage, because going back to this issue of all these risks that are happening right now, all these challenges, and they're all related, whether we're talking about climate change or clean energy transition, or geopolitical challenges in the Middle East and the implications, all of this becomes difficult for markets to address in a meaningful way over the long term. Yeah. And the U.S., of course, has to make important decisions about, do we want to go down the road of having more industrial policy, right? Like the CHIPS Act. It's a huge step towards having industrial policy in a way that we have not had in a very long time. Do we need more of the kind of Manhattan Project type initiatives that give us that longer term view to get to technologies that are really going to be game changing? These are the kinds of questions that I think we're facing, along with, do we want to put more restrictions on capital flow leaving the U.S. so that it's not inadvertently funding our strategic competitors or our enemies, right, in the development of their military capability? Like, do we need a longer term view around that? We probably do. So coming to terms with that in a system where we have so much churn is also incredibly challenging.
Yeah, it's so interesting, some different ways to look at it, because here in the States, you hear about things that are, quote unquote, business unfriendly, or, your regulations and environmental concerns and all these different kind of rules you have to play by. But from what I'm hearing from you, it's like in China, they also have those same hurdles. They're just different in that it's the data collection and the cooperation with the government and so forth that can make it a little tricky. So definitely very interesting. The last point I wanted to ask you about was on that kind of long-term, short-term vision. So I think most people would see right now in America, it just seems so polarizing that, we had Trump and you had half the country saying, I'll do anything that's not Trump. And then you had Biden saying, I'm going to undo everything that Trump did and start anew. And now you certainly have, the Republicans coming in for the next election saying, okay, we're going to do the exact opposite of Biden. It just seems like we're going, like the pendulum's swinging all the way from one side to the other. Do you think that's really happening, or is there a lot of middle ground that just does not get addressed? Like, has Biden carried over Trump policies with a smile on his face that we haven't seen?
Exactly. I think that's a very astute question, because some of this is rhetoric, right? And some of it is reality in terms of the shifts on policy. So in the economic space, when we're talking about measures for economic security, economic resilience, and even national security, the playbook is somewhat finite. And that's where we see, I think, a little bit less play, even if the rhetoric looks a little bit different. For example, are we likely to have a Republican administration coming in 2024 that would entirely remove us from Ukraine and from supporting Israel? That's unlikely in my view. Could we see some tweaks in that policy? Yeah, we might. So that stands in contrast to some of the other issues. I guess more on the kind of societal front, where we're talking about how an agenda is perceived around LGBTQ or abortion, or some of the other domestic issues where there's such a difference in terms of the approach. So I really think it matters in terms of what issues we're talking about, and whether there's rhetoric around that, or whether it's real in terms of those positions being so diametrically opposed across our two-party system. But you made a great example. Biden coming in and really not changing some of the core things that Trump did, including some of the tariffs on China, and including the immigration policies at the border. I mean, they're starting to change, but they didn't for a long time, and there was a really good reason why they didn't, because some of them actually worked.
I think that was one of the staples of Trump's administration, is like right out the gates, he, without saying so, almost kind of declared this trade war on China. So most of the those tariffs and those things that it hit the markets kind of hard initially, and then we got adjusted to it. So most of those are still in effect. Like, those haven't been gutted.
A good number of them are, and then of course Biden has taken it a step further with, an executive order limiting outbound investment to China around certain technologies. We've passed the CHIPS Act, which has had huge implications for China. So he's actually built around
common ground.
Absolutely.
I don't know why you don't hear more about that. But with the border, and again, there's rhetoric to get involved there, but it seems so much like Trump said, we're just putting up a wall. And then Biden said, we're tearing the wall down. And I don't know, how that kind of unfolded. I mean, it seems in some respects that is the case.
Yeah.
But.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting that I think there's still some money being spent on the wall, if I understand correctly. I think Biden is really struggling. The immigration numbers are way up, particularly the illegal numbers. And that, having worked on the border issues now for more than 2 decades, it's absolutely befuddling to me that we can't come to an agreement. I think there is a tremendous amount of middle ground on securing the border, but the rhetoric around that is not politically convenient, right? It's just become so difficult to move out of the narrative and move into the kinds of solutions that we need. I think most people would agree that we need to have a secure border. Sure. And there are lots of ways that we can do that, but we need to have a secure border, and we need it now. Having said that, we also need a sane policy on immigration, because one of the reasons why we're continuing to have good economic vibrancy in this country is because we've had pretty solid immigration, and it's helped offset our low birth rates. Unlike China, where they have a huge demographic issue, not unlike Japan in some ways. And they're going to face a huge headwind around that. So immigration is absolutely essential to the economic model in this country. And we're really not having an honest conversation about that. And that's a shame, because we need to. We really need to.
Yeah. And that was one of the things in my book I talked a lot about, was kind of these population dynamics and how, aging, and you're getting to see the precursor in Japan and how that's going to affect us in China on a much bigger scale, just by virtue of how large they are. That immigration has always seemed to be a bit of our, our secret weapon, going back from, like you mentioned earlier, the Manhattan Project, and so many of those people, they were not born here in America, and then they came here and developed all this technology for our benefit.
Right. Absolutely.
So,
And I'm going to say something, and it may sound a little controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I think we need to not only completely revisit the question of immigration and what it means to the economic security and resilience of this country, but we need to look at what's happening in China right now with their huge youth unemployment numbers. We're talking over 20% of Chinese youth are, for the most part, educated and unemployed. That's a recipe for disaster for China if they can't figure out a way to employ these folks. But a lot of them are trained in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. We desperately need these types of skills. And if we are smart, we'd be thinking about ways to attract the best and brightest talent from all over the world to come to this country and help us build the systems that we need for the future.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we take away US jobs in the process. We have plenty. So we need to really think more strategically about that. I mean, there couldn't be a worse time to have a conversation about bringing more Chinese, young graduates and students to this country. But we may look back at this as a missed opportunity if we don't think more strategically about how to capture talent.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a strange dynamic that it seems like they have what we need, being, trained young talent, and we have the jobs, and then vice versa. They've got the trained young talent, but they obviously don't have the jobs for them. It seems like a perfect marriage aside from all the other things that we've discussed so far. So, well, we'll see what the future holds there. But I know you're busy, and I really want to get some of your insights on, the latest news, of course, what's going on in Israel. So just by way of quick introduction, so I had recently read, according to the UN, the unemployment rate in Gaza is 47%, and over 80% of Gaza lives in poverty. Yet Hamas, which runs Gaza and has ruled since 2007 without any elections or anything, they have an alleged military budget of about $100 million to $350 million annually. And our State Department said that Iran provides about $100 million to Hamas. And this is another little bit of my research. So in an interview that was on Russia Today TV, a Hamas official, Ali Baraka, he said, and I quote, "First and foremost, it is Iran that is giving us money and weapons." Can you just kind of give us some context here of how Hamas came to be? And they seem to have this stranglehold here. And my biggest fear from just what I see is the public relations and that's kind of my fear for Israel, is they're just bombarding Gaza. And I think a lot of the international community sees it as, kind of big Israel going into this little area, blowing them off the map, which I think plays to Hamas's benefit, that they can just show this footage of possibly civilians or just property being destroyed at the hands of Israel. There's so many layers to this, but maybe we can start with kind of the finances of it all. Like, what is going on over there?
Yeah. Let's definitely talk about the money. It's absolutely the case that a good chunk of the military capability that Hamas has developed over the last, I guess 10 to 15 years is a result of funds from Iran. Absolutely. So there's no way to really manage the Hamas threat without figuring out what we do about Iran and that flow of funds. So that stands in contrast to other funding that Hamas has received. Actually, quite a bit has come from Qatar, for example, but a lot of it has been coordinated with both Israel and the U.S. and ostensibly has gone in for humanitarian purposes. The problem is that it's difficult to create the barriers around where that money actually ends up. I mean, and in my view, almost impossible to say that money earmarked for humanitarian funding is only going for humanitarian purposes. Mm-hmm. It's just, we don't have that, what I would call the integrity corridor, to really be able to track that. That money, and so that's certainly part of the problem, and it's a catch-22 for the international community, for those who want to be sure that the citizens of Gaza actually have what they need. It's a terrible situation there, mm-hmm. But being able to do that without enriching Hamas is difficult. And actually, Hamas has done a pretty good job of setting up a taxation structure as well around supplies that have come in to Gaza over the years. So that has also generated funding for them. And then we know that they've, to some extent, used crypto mechanisms as well. So there's cold hard cash coming in, but there are also other ways that they leverage decentralized finance and crypto. So it's a somewhat complicated picture, and figuring out how to deal with the terrorist threat, but but limit the civilian implications, as you've mentioned, is really difficult. And it's such a constrained area and such a difficult area to be able to to fight within. I mean, there's nothing worse than urban warfare.
Yeah.
Right. It's just there's so many
even worse
uncertainties.
is in tunnels, which is
Yes. So it's really kind of a perfect storm of bad news for everybody. For those who are still stuck in Gaza and those who have to go in and fight.
And so, with that in mind, with it a perfect storm for everybody, which is the last thing that you ever want to enter. I feel like this is a story that's now as old as time for us, where you have these kind of altruistic nations like the US saying, okay, we'll help out. Here's weapons, here's aid, here's money. And then in these different pockets of the world, it seems to be the corrupt and the bad guys say, okay, great, thank you. And they take it all. And now it's like we're fighting ourselves. Yeah. I mean, I know this is another big question, but do you put an end to that? I mean, is there a time where it's like, okay, as hard as it seems, everybody turns to America, what should we do? Do we ever just kind of say, we're not getting involved?
Yeah, really good question. I think there's a legitimate question as to how many of these fronts we can fight at any given time. That's certainly a concern. I think we have to be more mindful of the framework in which we go into these conflicts and how we get them resolved. One thing that's very clear is that if we compromise in terms of the question around human rights, human dignity, we're in trouble. I really feel that way. That we need to have a little more consistency in terms of that values framework of human rights and how we protect that, and that's challenging, right? Because what's happening right now in Gaza and a lot of innocent folks who are kind of caught in the crosshairs, it's proving to be very difficult to maintain any semblance of humanitarian engagement right now. And that's horrible. And I think, Biden's trying to do that by, trying to slow down to some extent the conflict. But on the other hand, that feels like it's at odds right now with the idea that Israel should defend itself and should take the steps necessary. And so these kinds of conflicts, across policies are going to become more and more challenging for us. And the rest of the world is watching. They're watching. And they want to know, does the U.S. think that a life in Gaza is as important as a life elsewhere? And we have to be honest about how we're, how presumably the answer to that is yes. So how do we make sure that we do as much as we can to solve these conflicts in the right way without ceding to authoritarian interests who are trying to upend democratic rules and norms? That is happening. It's happening. And a lot of that, a lot of the false reporting that we've seen come out of Gaza, I mean, that's front and center, right? In terms of erosion of our role. But, we have to make sure that we're doing everything that we can from a foreign policy perspective to maintain the values framework around what we're doing.
Yeah, and it seems like kind of the shift in the modern era are these proxy wars where and it seems like they kind of have the playbook worked out of like, okay, we can start these little conflicts and they can be, relatively speaking, small, but then we get the biggest power in the world, America, almost directly involved within a week. And now here it is, this big debate. So, I think Iran, they got it down pat of how to kind of fund these different little pockets and set up these little proxy wars. So I think that's kind of another huge question. If maybe you can give us some insight to, is my understanding is under the Obama administration, we more or less gave $150 billion or freed up $150 billion of assets to Iran. And there was, the report that they gave, $1.7 billion in actual cash because we didn't have the banking connections. So it was actually done via cash, which seemed very odd. All that happens, I think everybody just takes a step back and says, like, that sounds insane. Like, we knew how bad the Iranian government was for, a lot of our allies and ourselves. Yeah. Why then, why did we do that? What was the rationale?
Yeah, well, I think that was that certainly in retrospect proved to be a very bad move. But even before that, I would have argued that we shouldn't be we shouldn't be working with terrorist states in that way. I think the idea was, well, there's a way that we can support some humanitarian interests or free up some funding here and there, and that might give us a little bit of negotiation room. But I think at the end of the day, this question around Iran and their financing is absolutely critical. We're going to have to do a better job of understanding where the money is going, how it's being derived, blasting open the financial opacity around how these regimes and terrorist organizations are continuing to get funded, and just stop the funding. We have to do that. Without the funding, Hamas becomes not irrelevant, but much less dangerous. Yep. Disrupting Hamas is about disrupting the flow of funds from Iran. We have to address that, and if we don't, then we're not getting anywhere. So, our Iran policy has been somewhat chaotic, to say the least, over the last 10 years. I think it's time to just take a hard look at it, and we need to start leading again when it comes to strategies for countering terror finance. We have to put that back on the agenda like we did after 9/11. There are new ways and new mechanisms that money is flowing through the financial system. Unfortunately, in some cases, we are enabling that by the opacity in our systems, and that would be a huge step forward in dealing with rogue regimes if we could solve that issue.
So to put you on the hot seat here, maybe as we kind of near a conclusion, if you're sitting in the Oval Office right now, and that's objective number one for you is to cut off their funding, make it harder, how do you do it? What do you do?
Yeah. So you go after all of the formal and informal networks and ways that money moves through the system. So there are actually some very straightforward things that can be done. For example, we could get much more activity underway around beneficial ownership. So understanding the natural persons behind offshore accounts, behind corporations, shell corporations, making sure that we understand that wherever Iran, for example, has connectivity through its proxies into offshore banking, into companies that are serving as conduits, as facilitators, that we just blast all of that wide open. So that would be a really important thing to do. We need to go much more in depth around the crypto threats and understanding the connectivity between Iran and other regimes and how money is flowing through exchanges and mixers and through crypto finance. So that's another thing we can do. And then, we really just need to look at other sources of funding for the Iranian regime that can be cut off. This is tricky because, again, we have, millions and millions of people in Iran who, we're trying to target the regime. We're not trying to target the people, So that's difficult, and we have to be careful about how we do it. But there are more actions that we could take with respect to Iranian sanctions and their key revenue sources, including oil.
Yep. Yeah, and that's what I was going to bring up. It seems like these terrorist groups, these nefarious actors, they have drug trades, they have other things like that they pursue kind of organically, I guess you could say. But then the other big, more legitimate one that seems to be the common thread through almost all of our adversaries is the strength in oil.
Yep.
And I don't know. I mean, if that goes away, if we truly get energy independent, and most of the developed world does, I don't know if that cuts them off at the knees or if they have kind of some sort of plan B ready to go behind that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's certainly a long-term play. And being able to have a transformation in terms of, our energy policy and how we engage with certain parts of the world, because we no longer have that dependency on oil, is huge. That is a massive shift.
Yeah.
Now, it's not happening anytime soon, but do we need to be working towards that? Without question. This shift should be coming as quickly as possible. recognizing that, that we're not talking about a world where we don't have a carbon, there's not some level of a carbon footprint. There's going to be a reliance on petroleum, for a very long time to come. But we can significantly reduce it in a way that would have, huge implications for foreign policy. It's just not a solution right now. But we do have levers, right, where we can crack down even more. But going back to this question around alliances and axes, as long as Russians and the Chinese and others are willing to purchase oil from rogue regimes, we're going to have a challenge.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to be more vigilant about it. There's a lot of evasion going on.
Yeah. There's so much to unpack in this. I feel like this could be a 3-hour conversation. Excuse me. But I know we're getting short on time here. Is there anything that maybe you'd like to leave our listeners with of just kind of this outlook here? I mean, are we at a point in time where it's like you shouldn't be able to sleep at night? Are we worried about the future, or can we look at the glass is half full and there's more peace than evil and get excited about the future? Maybe just kind of like some closing comments on what you're hoping to see or what you would recommend.
So I think there's a level of vigilance now required of citizens in this country that perhaps we haven't felt in a long time. And it is important that we kind of step up to that challenge. And I don't mean it in the sense that, one needs to understand all the global dynamics in great detail, but that it's important to make sure that our country is running in the best possible way. And that's where I think the citizen engagement could really step up. And by that, I mean taking part in a political process, thinking through what needs to happen locally as well as at the state level and nationally. The stronger our democratic processes and framework and economy, our foreign policy will be. The two are connected. And that's what's really come home for me over the last few years, that we can't really think about foreign policy in a vacuum. Not that we ever could, but it's even more challenging now, right? And more dangerous if we don't understand that the health of our democracy and our systems is the single most important thing for us in terms of our foreign policy. Because it's how we're perceived. It's the model that we're projecting to the world. It's our ability to have economic power projection where we want it, when we want it. It's the strength of the US dollar. It's all based on a set of democratic rules and norms and engagement and market activity that we've been pretty successful in terms of exporting globally. But we're getting to a point where we're going to need to rethink some of that in terms of how much benefit it's providing to the rest of the world. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
But number two, it requires us to double down to make sure that that our country is in as strong a position as we can be. And that's why what's happening on Capitol Hill is so problematic right now, because it's sending a different message to the world. So I think as Americans, we need to rally a bit more, find the common ground, and figure out a path forward where we can work on our own economic resilience, but also ensure that our global leadership is leading to economic resilience and stability elsewhere.
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement. I think you hit the nail on the head there. And I feel like we do ourselves an injustice as a country where we don't always showcase our best to the world when we can come up with incredible technology or innovation or a great conversation that maybe gets some time a day. And then, you have a meme of the president tripped on a curb and they want to broadcast it 1 billion times over. And it's like,
it's nonsense.
Yeah, it's almost like if you had your Facebook profile, would you show your worst moment or your silliest act? But as a country, it seems to be like that's like what we want to do to ourselves.
Yeah.
So it can be frustrating.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for the time, Elaine. I know we covered a lot of ground here. Hopefully everybody had some takeaways here, and we'll certainly dig a little bit deeper and get more informed on these issues because what a time it is to be alive.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, thanks so much for the opportunity to join you. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. And everyone, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Caderna podcast. I'm Brian Caderna. Today we had the pleasure of speaking with Elaine Dezenski. We'll put in the show notes where you can follow some of her research. And please keep on tuning in and leave us a review wherever it is you're listening or watching. Until next time, be well. This podcast is intended for the general public and for informational purposes only. The show does not provide any recommendations or investment advice regarding any specific account type, service, strategy, or product, or to otherwise act in any fiduciary or other capacity. Please contact a financial professional for guidance and information that is specific to your situation. Brian Caderna does not provide tax or legal advice. Please contact your accountant or legal advisor to discuss your situation. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by Park Avenue Securities, Guardian, or Caderna Financial Team, and opinions stated are their own. All investments contain risk and may lose value. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. References to specific securities, asset classes, and financial markets are for illustrative purposes only and do not constitute a solicitation, offer, or recommendation to purchase or sell a security. Brian Caderna is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, PAS. OSJ 300 Broadacres Drive, Suite 175, Bloomfield, New Jersey, 07003. Phone number 973-244-4420. Securities products and advisory services offered through PAS, member FINRA SIPC. Financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. PAS is a wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Caderna Financial Team is not an affiliate or subsidiary of PAS or Guardian. California Insurance License Number 0K04194.